thank you everybody for coming to our panel. And there was a bit of I guess, confusion in the title of the panel. It's basically a state of trust in media, but we're going to try to extrapolate this question a little bit beyond the world of media. What we wanted to discuss today was where are the pockets of distrust and trust in society in general, and also how does that vary across markets? And what should we do as the media to hold different leaders and opinion makers accountable in the world of trust? As media professionals, trust is, if not the only or main currency that we deal in. We have to have credibility with our organizations and then what we do. And also, we are providing a service to the public to find out the truth, essentially. So we want to do first bring our two panelists. Let me introduce them. First, we have David Schlesinger. He is the founder and managing director of Tripod Advisors. Before that, he was the chairman of Thomson Reuters China, and before that, global editor-in-chief of Reuters News. He brings decades of experience in the Asia region to the table. And then we also have Andrew Kirk. He's the managing director of Edelman in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Been working in the Asia-Pacific region for about 12 years, and you have this passion for rugby, apparently, as well.
Yep.
So,
among other things, but yeah.
So every year, Edelman does a trust barometer. They survey about the top 25% of influencers across markets, and they get a pretty accurate gauge of what people trust, what people don't trust. And I thought that it might be a good starting off point. I saw the Seoul version where they focused specifically on the Korean markets. I thought that was very insightful, and I thought that it might help us as journalists as well to craft our stories, like find the particular interview subjects that may resonate more with the public, and topics that might help us tell our stories better. So I want to first turn it over to Andrew, where he give the presentation.
I've got an inbuilt microphone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I just don't like using microphones, so I start to sing and do karaoke. And it's Sunday morning, I would have done that last night. So I want to take you through some data from the Edelman Trust Barometer. We've been doing this now for 13 years. Hong Kong was the most recent entry into the Trust Barometer. We had our data get cut about 2 years ago, so this year will be our third year. The research goes into market in 2 months' time. But I'm going to take you through what we found for 2013, more of an Asia-Pacific view. Quickly, just to tell you what the research looked at. We looked at, as you can see, online survey in 26 countries, 31,000 respondents. This year was slightly different. We looked at general population and what we call the informed publics. General population is what it says, it's the general population. We interviewed 1,000 people per country. Informed publics, we actually have a criteria. So they're usually above 25, college educated, top 25% of household income. They must consume media and engage in businesses and policy. I've been doing that for 13 years. So that's the cut of who we looked at. When I go through the data, you'll see the little symbols of the informed publics and the general population at the top of this slide, which will give you an indication of who we're actually talking about in that section. So why trust matters? We look at trust slightly different to reputation. So at Edelman, we talk about trust and reputation, two very important things. But we talk about reputation as being everything up to this point in time, and trust everything ahead. A little bit like driving a car. Reputation is everything you see in the rear vision mirror. Trust is everything you see ahead of yourself. A lot of companies and organisations and businesses manage reputation. They manage the things that have happened. We advocate that we should be managing the things that are ahead, looking towards what will build trust, which will give us better reputation as well. So it's a slightly different look at it. So this is just the breakdown of all the markets. Ooh, bit of mood lighting. All right. Can everyone see that okay? So 2011, Brazil was the most trusted country in the world. That dropped dramatically in 2012. I think what's significant for us here in Asia is to notice that the blue are what we call the trusting markets. Grey are neutral markets, red are distrusting markets. There has been a swing in the last year back to a far more trusting state. 2012 was a severe lack of trust, and we actually tagged that year just the crisis of trust. This year it's more about the crisis of leadership. So while the institutions are trusted, leaders within those institutions are not trusted. But in the trusting, you'll notice how many of those countries or markets are actually from Asia. So Asia is a very trusting market. So when you look at the data, what you'll notice is that Asian data is always far more trusting than global. So we don't necessarily have a look at comparison between, say, China and the US. What we look at is trends within China. So we've been doing China now for, I think, 6 years, and we follow the trend of where that's tracking, as opposed to measure it against the states. The other thing that we do is we do not ask what trust is. So we don't ask someone to explain trust, and we don't tell them what trust is, because we have the assumption that trust is slightly different in every market. And if we try and tell people what we are measuring when it comes to trust, it will influence the way they think. So we don't actually tell them or ask them to measure trust, however they want to measure it themselves. So we look at general population. General population usually is less trusting than informed publics, which is interesting. So the informed publics are usually reading more media, consuming more business news, engaged in policy. But we are finding that the general population is far more distrusting than the informed publics. Here is a mirror between APAC and global. You'll see that APAC is on the left-hand side of the data. APAC is greater in trust than global. So if you look at media, 66% trust the media. Globally, it's 57%. Government, 60% to 48%. That's actually business is 64 to 58, and NGOs is 68 to 63. NGOs remain the most trusted institution, which is interesting because 6 years ago, we started seeing the rise of them. About the same time, we saw the rise of social media. So NGOs have had the opportunity to tell their story through many more channels now and control their own content, which is, we believe, allowed them to build their reputation and trust. So why do we not trust business and government? The reasons for trusting business less is corruption and fraud and wrong incentives driving business and decisions. 50% of people, that makes about 50% of the reasons why we don't trust businesses. And reasons for trusting government less, poor performance and incompetence is a big one. Corruption and fraud and wrong incentives. So quite similar, but they're the attributes. When you look at from media coverage, they're the stories that are driving real damage in trust and reputation for businesses and governments. So what are the most trusted institutions? Technology still remains number one as the most trusted institution, has been number one for many years. Our assumption on that is that technology is something you touch and play with every day. So it's something that you're heavily involved in and you trust what is around you, your iPad, your iPhone, your Galaxy Note, whatever it might be. Media sits down around 50%, which isn't too bad, but it's still nowhere near as high as it should be. And then financial services always swings around the bottom. So here's a quick snapshot of Australia, a very, very distrusting society, China and India. And as you'll see, media in Australia is 31%. So I was a journalist in Australia for 8 years and then I moved into PR, so I'm not quite sure where I stand now because my media mates would tell me it's even less trusted than the media. But I would argue with that. So it's quite interesting to see the breakdown and how it changes in different markets. Media in China and India are quite high at 76 and 79%, but I do remind you that in Asian markets, the percentage is a little bit higher when it comes to trust. They're far more trusting markets. As I said, NGOs still the highest trust of institutions. As you can see, NGOs, especially in the Asia region, do extremely well. China's quite interesting. China had a lot of distrust in NGOs, and now they've got far more trust. And I suppose you can't call them NGOs. They're sort of quasi-government organisations. But as soon as the finger-wagging NGOs started losing some credibility in China, and Greenpeace, for example, WWF coming in, pointing their finger at China, NGOs' trust went down. When they changed the way they operate, so they're a bit more collaborative now, their trust has gone up. Trust in media is actually growing over time. This is despite some pretty big media scandals last year, but there was also some very big stories last year. So what we find with media, and I'd be interested to hear David's view, with media, when there are big stories and big events, and then we turn to the media to find out about what is taking place in the world, trust in media increases dramatically. In quiet years of news, when news isn't as great, as big, not as many scandals being uncovered, it's interesting, trust in media decreases. Online search engines are a highly trusted source of information. What we're finding as well, and all this data is free and it's on Edelman's website if you want to use it for anything. A lot of people have started to use it for the work that they do. What we're finding, which is interesting, is that when you look at traditional media and you measure it against someone like Google, Google is now called a news service. So when people are looking at talking about media, they actually call Google a media service. Even though it's just a search engine, they go to that before they go anywhere else to search for news. So when we ask people, what do you use as your news portal? Google. Everywhere except China, of course. So, crisis of leadership. So let's have a look at what we look at. We asked people about spokespeople. So we said to them, who do you trust from an organisation to tell the truth? And I've given a bit of a snapshot of people across the region. Academic or expert rates pretty well. You should probably ignore Japan at the moment. Japan had a pretty big issue last year, if anyone remembers that. And trust in Japan is the lowest we've seen in any country at any time. No one in Japan trusts anybody. So they are in a dire situation when it comes to trust. And you can see that from just the sheer change in numbers. But certainly academic and experts still rate as the most credible spokespeople, technical expert in the company second. A person like yourself continues to rise. So we are more trusting of people like ourselves. Social media is driving that. In 2007, we saw a massive increase in trust of people like yourself. It dropped off in 2009 when we realised that not everybody on the internet is telling the truth and is smart. And now it's coming back again because we are starting to choose and produce and create our own content with the people we want to speak to. CEOs have very little trust, and that's our question. That's our premise of the crisis of trust. When you see a CEO stand up, we very rarely believe they will tell the truth, and then they only sit a little bit higher than at government officials or regulators. So, trust in ethics and morality is very low. So what we asked, we said, do you trust the business leaders to do the following? Do you trust them to solve social or societal issues? And only 19% of people in the globe and 20% in Asia said they can do that. Correct issues within the industry that are experiencing problems, make ethical and moral decisions. That's really worrying. And the worst one is at the end there, we said, do you trust business leaders to tell the truth regardless of how complex or unpopular it is? And only 18 and 19% of the population believe that business leaders will tell the truth. So from a business point of view, that is very, very concerning. So when it comes to trust, when you're leading a business and trying to communicate, especially trying to communicate through the media is generally cynical, has a negative eye, is less trusting, and overlay that with the fact that the general population don't trust you as well, businesses are in real trouble trying to express what their story is and be trusted. I'll leave you to this one before we start having a bit of a chat. So this one I find the most interesting. So what we did is we asked people, do you trust businesses, and then do you trust business leaders to tell the truth? Do you trust governments? And do you trust government leaders to tell the truth? So I've broken this down for you in different countries. So globally, we think businesses will tell the truth. It's about a neutral trust level of 50%. But we only think that the business leaders are at 18. China's at 67 to 32, India is 68 to 34, South Korea 35 to 13, APAC 55 to 24, and Japan is about 45 to 35, 44 to 35. So in APAC, that differential is quite enormous. So what we're saying is that while the general population say, yeah, we do have a relatively trusting aspect when it comes to businesses, those leading businesses, we don't trust at all. And it's even more pronounced when it comes to government as well. So while we trust the institution, we very rarely trust the business leaders. China's a great example where we look at that 71% trust in the institution. Those of you who live outside of China will always ask, why is it so high? Our view is that in China, there is a great trust in the institution of government, but there is not so great trust in the people involved in the institution of government. So that's a real dilemma for Chinese legislators and Chinese politicians if they care about it. So I'm going to leave that for the moment. I've got plenty more that I can go through, but I think it'd be far more interesting to hear from David and get your questions as well. But as you can see, there is a real crisis in trust of leadership, which is interesting from a media point of view because it's usually the business leaders that get fronted out to talk to the media when it comes to expressing their story, their narrative, and especially in a crisis. Thanks. Thank you.
So part of this discussion I really wanted to set up as a discussion between journalists versus PR representative, because a lot of the times, you come across some of the gatekeepers, right? When we try to do our stories that cover scandals or cover business leaders, we often have to go through gatekeepers like PR firms. And so, I guess through just the natural course of this dialogue, I think it might be helpful to, let people know, like, what's a good way to manage this relationship. But before that, initially, David, what's your reaction to this year's Trust Barometer? How has it differed from perhaps other years?
Yeah, well, thanks. I wanted to focus in on the media section itself, since this is a conference of journalists, and since I come from a media background, and it worries me a bit because I see the figures where Edelman shows that trust in media is growing, and I really worry that people in the audience or people who see this start to become complacent about it, and I think that's absolutely the wrong reaction because I think instead of looking at an aggregate question like that where trust is not defined for good reasons, and media itself is not really defined for also probably good reasons, you could very easily come to the wrong conclusion. So I think we ought to start with a focused look at something like a Gallup poll, which looks at traditional media, where people in this room get their paychecks from, and where I think the last time there was a 50-50 split on trust in mass media was in 2005. 2005, so that's 8 years ago. Last year, when asked, how much trust do you have in the mass media to report fully, accurately, and fairly, that's every one of you in this room, 60% of the people in the US said not very much or none at all. 60% don't trust at all. And I think the U.S. there is a leading indicator in what's going to be happening in the rest of the world. But even just leaving aside the polls, people are voting with their feet in terms of readership, viewership, and revenues dropping. Now, maybe media does still okay compared to some other institutions like government, but I think media is failing in some other ways, and there's some very serious and worrying things we got to look at. Number one, headcount. Again, something that hits everybody in this room. Estimates for U.S. newspaper cutbacks in 2012 put the industry down 30% from its peak in 2000, and below 40,000 full-time professional employees for the first time since 1978. So again, this is a leading indicator about what's going to be happening in the rest of the world as well. And when professional headcount starts to fall, that sets up this vicious circle where the traditional institutions can do less and less of the type of reporting that builds trust and builds reputation and builds a feeling that, in fact, the traditional media is where you go for the stories that you need. Popularity, there's a move away from traditional in most countries. There's the rise of the non-traditional and non-professional. And I think that's leading to a need to completely redefine what we mean by professional and what we mean by media. Accuracy. Huge mistakes and huge scandals on the part of many of the big traditional media players where you would have expected trust and reputation to be at the forefront. You know, everything from hacking scandals in the UK for News International to Bloomberg reporters looking at their clients' logins to the pretty shoddy reporting on the Boston bombings. Traditional media has not actually earned much trust this year. Expertise. How often do you actually see someone on TV, with maybe a couple of exceptions, of course, or read reports by people who truly know in detail about this particular subject matter that they're talking about? People are expected to report widely, in a very broad, general way, and that means they can only skim the surface in terms of building expertise and building the type of experience that can build trust in reporting. So where is this going? I think it goes to maybe a half a dozen points that we ought to talk about. Number one, there's a disintermediation of the journalist, and this goes right to that PR journalism question you're talking about. I see more and more governments and companies communicating directly with the reader, consumer, client, and eliminating the journalist entirely. So what does that mean for the profession? There's the rise of the opinion commentator versus the factual journalist. Facts are commoditized, opinion has more value or more perceived value, and so the traditional reporting that has given the traditional journalistic institutions their trust, their reputation, is less and less valuable. There's what I would call the professionalization of the amateur and the amateurization of the professional. So you have people who never did anything journalistic suddenly doing journalistic things, looking out their window, writing a tweet, writing a blog post, reporting on something that they see. Conversely, you have professionals who should be spending time gathering string, doing research, building expertise, instead trying to ape what they see happening on social media. And you have a complete blurring of roles, which I'm not sure is helpful for anyone in the end. Trust in brands, trust in media brands. I mean, this is your area of specialization. It's very hard to build, easy to damage, but it's also hard to monetize. And I know this intimately from my time at Reuters, which built a brand over 100 and whatever years from 1850. You say you're from Reuters, and people say, "Oh, yes, Reuters, of course." But then when you actually ask them to pay for the news that they're getting, or to that's a different question entirely. So trust, on the one hand, is this vague, warm, fuzzy feeling, but how do you actually translate that into something that is monetizable? I could go on, but I think that maybe what we have to start thinking about in the industry, in forums like this, in universities like this, is how to get that holy grail to come together of trust, authority, popularity, and value. And it's only when you get those four things working together that there actually is any hope for us as a profession.
So a big part of that is trust. If we don't have trust in our media institutions, then that actually affects the long-term job security for everybody in this room. From your presentation, Andrew, you said that building trust in media recently, or maybe even over the years, comes from when journalists actually uncover scandals. They are the people that the public looks to uncover the truth. Does that, if that rises, if trust in media rises from that avenue, does that kind of make you feel bad? Does that come at the expense of your clients? And will you shut down some access to your clients if that happens?
No, it's actually the exact opposite. I
I truly believe that a strong media is absolutely critical to the success of my clients as well. We don't work for clients that are dodgy, shodgy and crappy and rubbishy. We don't lie, we don't spin, that's old school. And I think there's a real big misperception, and there are still PR people out there who hang a shingle on a window and say, I was an ex-journalist and I can spin you away out of anything. But those days are dying. David made a very important point. There's 22 big changes that are taking place. One is that truth will stay number one. You have to tell the truth, tell it first, tell it fast, and get it out there. If you don't, you'll be shot down very quickly. The journalist who you speak to may not do it straight away, but there are enough other amateur journalists out there who will find holes in your story. So you must tell the truth at all times. The second thing is that, and this is where I think the media need to be concerned, is that companies are becoming their own media companies. And I think if the media don't sharpen their act, and I think you're absolutely right, that we need to start really focusing on what our professional role is as journalists. Otherwise, more and more companies will just bypass the media. And they know that people will come straight to them. Stakeholders who have an interest in that organisation will get information from that organisation. The biggest rise in content from a company now is their website. So people trust their website, and that's moved from about 15% 5 years ago to up to 50% now. So the company website, which was something that 3 or 4 years ago us PR experts said was dying, now we've had to go back and go, no, it's great, the website, we love the website. So the website's now an embassy, or their chance to have their newsroom placed on that. Look at HP. HP have created their own newsroom. GE have their own newsroom. The big companies in the world are hiring journalists to write all their news stories in their organisation, and they're not bothering going to the media anymore.
Right, and speaking of that, years and years and years ago when I did internships in PR, a lot of our time was spent cultivating relationships with journalists and pitching the media. But now when I talk to some PR friends these days, I'm like, so how much of your day is dedicated to pitching? And they're almost kind of quiet or almost silent about that. Has that relationship kind of disappeared and now it's all direct, as you said?
Yeah, I think so my business, media relations is still a critical part of what we do in PR. But the fact is it's now stakeholder management. It's about looking at all the people that are going to influence your company and have an impact on your reputation and trust, and going and speaking to them. PR is all about storytelling. It's not about do you have a friend who's an editor. And the fact is that you cultivate journalist relationships and they're gone in 3 months. So my kids in my office who are 24, 25, 26, out of uni, are trying to build relationships in Hong Kong. And those relationships usually end up with that journalist sending us a CV saying, can I come and work for you? So it's a real challenge. I find that really upsetting that the average age of journalists has dropped. Their skill set is decreasing, but their ask of content is increasing. So there's less journalists producing more content, and there's no way you're going to get high-quality, researched journalism if the pressure is the way it is. And also, when I left journalism 13 years ago, there were many checks and balances before that would allow my story to go to air. Nowadays, there's... Yeah.
So, David, how do we make ourselves more relevant?
Well, I think that the only real trick is in that expertise sector, is to build these niches of content and to become a real subject matter expert in 1, 2, or 3 areas and concentrate on that. I think the era of the generalist, alas, is over. I mean, I'm a generalist by nature, and I love flitting about from thing to thing, but I don't think that's very useful. I think that what's useful is to really be the Hong Kong expert in travel, where you know so much about that of course Cathay Pacific has to come to you because you are the one who knows, you are the one who has influence, you are the one who has followers. So building on from expertise is building your personal brand. Now, as an editor-in-chief, I had very let's say, ambivalent feelings about this. Now that I'm out of the journalism business, I see that for journalists to build their personal brand is absolutely vital. It's much more important to be David Schlesinger, the expert in sushi, than it is to be David Schlesinger of Reuters. Because, as you say, people move every 6 months, 10 months. I had 25 years in Reuters. No one's going to have 25 years in Reuters anymore. I mean, that's the era of someone staying their whole career in a company it's done. So you have to build your personal brand so that you take that expertise, that reputation, that trust with you when you go.
And that's, let's add to that, and that's the value. So if you want to make money as a journalist, you have to have a brand. You have to be known for something. Otherwise, you will just become another one that is out there. And from a PR professional, you said before, is there conflict? I hunt and search out the very best journalists to work with because they are the most trusted ones. They are the most respected ones. So if they are speaking about my organisation or my company, that trust in my organisation increases. And that's why we use the media, because it's a credible source of information. And that's why we refuse to play with some other media, because they are untrusted and you just don't trust the way they manage the engagement.
And I think what's really interesting is how the interplay with social media now comes into that. In the old days, you went to the institution. You went to Reuters because it had X number of thousand newspaper subscribers, or you went to the AP because every newspaper had it. These days you can go to the expert who might write for the small trade publication that has a very small circulation, but because that person tweets to 10,000 influential followers, because that person puts their story on Facebook as well, because there's that community that gets influenced by that person, it's almost immaterial which publication they hang their shingle on.
So what are some examples of cases, of stories that journalists have done that do increase trust in their own personal brand if they are branding themselves as a journalist and for the media institution that they're working for?
Well, I mean, one that just pops to mind is if you think about what Bloomberg did on China last year. It's very interesting that it probably hurt Bloomberg's China business, but it really built the reputation of their China bureau. And so...
You're talking about the Beaujolais scandal.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Xi Jinping finances, the finances of the 100 old families, whatever, where they really did follow the document trail. They built a very careful case showing the financial dealings. That was a wonderful piece of journalism that really built the reputation of the bureau and of the reporters who did it, and it probably simultaneously hurt their China business.
I think that's probably the best one from last year, because if you think about, I mean, the sad thing is that I don't know how many other organisations could invest the time, the resources, the money to do that. It was an excellent piece of journalism. And what upsets me most being an old journo is that even the way we judge good journalism these days, we don't critique it like we used to. We should be quite tough on our expectations of what good journalism is. And there are some great journalists out there. The best thing is that there's finally some money going into the States to fund a couple of groups to pay for journalists to do investigative reporting, which I think is something that has been lacking. I mean, if you just watch 60 Minutes now. So I grew up in 60 Minutes in Australia where they actually broke stories. Now they break celebrity gossip. I mean, it's so frustrating to think that the amount of resources and money spent on that program globally could fund everyone in this room to go and do some brilliant journalism and some great investigative work. And that's the sort of thing I think in the future the media has to really take note of and be known for what they can do and what they can uncover and really be the fourth estate.
So are we in a crisis where we can't really fulfill our role as the fourth estate? There's less resources going around. People are just trying to cover the basics and can't really go really in depth, besides like the few flagship, Washington Post, New York Times institutions.
I wouldn't call it a crisis. I think we're in a real transition phase. That I think that journalism 5 years from now will have very little relationship to journalism today or journalism 5 years previous. I think that institutions are changing. The role of the individual journalist is changing. The rise, as you say, of things like ProPublica, which funds specific projects. The rise of newsrooms within companies. I mean, just the ethics around that is something that's going to be evolving. And there may be a brave company that actually sets their in-house journalists free to do true reporting in the spirit of transparency, since transparency builds trust and builds, we just don't know. So I don't call it a crisis. I think it's exciting, but I think it's also, as in any period of transition, a bit mind-bending.
Unknown. Well, does anybody from the audience now have questions? I want to open it up.
I can just talk. Yeah, I have a question. I have a question for Andrew and a question for David. Actually, yeah. So I have a mic now. So for Andrew, I'd like to ask, like, how do you think businesses are ready? How willing do you think businesses are to cut profits in order to fuel good journalism in general? Because not every organization's like, Reuters, and especially in Asia, where like even in Hong Kong, like I think the journalism industry here in Hong Kong, they don't exactly make a lot of money. The newspaper that makes the most, I think, in Hong Kong is Apple Daily, and they succeed because they're writing
Is that news,
a lot
is
of
it?
they're writing a lot of like news stuff, like which are very sensational, and some of them are actually made up sometimes. So like that's the most circulated newspaper in Hong Kong, Chinese newspaper. And then my second question is to David. You mentioned that let me see. Yeah, you mentioned that journalists nowadays don't have enough time to build their portfolios, to build their own beats or expertise. So like, what is your view on the phenomenon that more and more media organizations are actually requiring journalists to tweet and maybe spend more time on the social media? Because and how do you think like the fact that journalists nowadays and traditional like big media organizations like do you think like the fact that they have to spend more time on social media actually increases the possibility of in quotation fast food journalism? Because well, you also mentioned that there are a lot of huge errors, right, which kind of surfaced like last year in reporting. Thank you.
My answer is pretty easy, that it's a business, so there is no organisation that's ever going to cut profit. And that's just a sad fact. It's very hard to go to your boss and say, look, I'm going to reduce my profit this year to do good for the world. There's a few organisations who've claimed to have tried it, but it's very, very difficult. And I think one of the other things, I think the media just missed the boat 5-8 years ago with social media. They should have been smarter about the way they were going to use that. They should have been, it's a bit like the music industry. They just failed to understand the digital world we moved into, and that now they're paying the price for that. As for Apple Daily, I don't call that a newspaper. That's a celebrity gossip piece of entertainment. And they make good money because but we never deal with them. So I refuse to speak with them. My clients don't get involved in them unless they're caught walking out with a celebrity or something like that. But my clients aren't that cool. I do boring big businesses. So, yeah.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that first. Reuters certainly never cut its profit to do journalism. I mean, I had a huge budget at Reuters. It was about $500 million a year. It's probably one of the biggest news budgets in the world. But I had to fight for every penny of that, and I fought for every penny of that because I worked with the business to justify that the news that we produced would actually help terminal sales or help our end clients do their work. So it was a pretty intimate relationship between the size of the newsroom budget and the revenue that was coming in. To your question about expertise, I mean, I think to blame the fact that journalists have to tweet is a bit simplistic, because I think that, to my other point about building a brand, it's very important for journalists to be on social media. My problem is that I don't think many news organizations have thought through their social media strategy, as Andrew just said. And so a lot of the tweeting is blind tweeting, and it's tweeting without much thought to the effect that it will have. To simply require, as some news organizations have, that journalists do a particular number of tweets in a day, I think violates the whole the whole idea of what social media should be about. But for a journalist who has done a good story to then tweet about that story, to draw attention to it, to tweet more about it, to try to create a conversation around it, I think is absolutely the right thing to do. No organization should require it, because the journalist should be requiring it of himself or herself. And if you're not doing it, then you're actually harming your professional standing and your professional future. I just think that to require a social media presence without a strategy behind it is silly, and that probably does detract from good journalism.
So just to quickly add on that, there's two other things that worry me. One is native advertising, because that is a real ethical issue, I think, for journalism, and that goes to a bit about profit and business. And the second piece is that I actually spend more time looking at the tweets of journalists now to get an understanding of what they're like. I think you can see more of their personality through Twitter than through their stories. So their stories they have to cover, but their tweets really tell you what they're interested in, what they care about, their tonality. And it doesn't take much for a journo to write a tweet. They live in 25 words or less world, so they bang out tweets easily. But it's making sure that the tweets are interesting, because sometimes, if your stream gets full of boring tweets from that journo, I can them pretty quickly. So I'd make sure that I track the ones I really find interesting, especially for the areas I know my businesses and my company will be interested in as well. So if you're not doing it now, you make sure you get involved and have a think about what you stand for, what you believe in, and what you want to write about, and that will make a big difference for you the value of you as a journalist.
Hi, I actually work at an NGO, so I'm really happy to see that NGOs are the most trusted institution. That's great. I guess I wanted to ask you guys, from a citizen's perspective, if mistrust is such a bad thing. It keeps us in check, it keeps us humble, it keeps us accountable for media people, it keeps them doing good journalism. It means that people are demanding more. So I was looking at the chart you had with the countries that are most trustful, and it really has nothing to do with level of democracy. And actually, the countries that are most trustful of institutions tend to be the less democratic. So I'm just wondering if a certain level of suspicion or questioning is necessary for deliberation that would be required in a flourishing democracy. So I just kind of wanted to pose you guys, because we're focusing on, lack of trust. Is that necessarily normatively a bad thing? And what are the factors that determine trust? Is it just reputation? So you mentioned some scandals. Or are there other factors? Is low trust also a sign of democracy or competition for information, freedom of the press? Maybe there's something more, and maybe we're being too harsh and focusing on low trust.
Yeah, it's interesting. I believe in a cynical world. I think you have to view the world with a negative eye all the time. So questioning is a very powerful thing. I train my children to ask why all the time. My oldest son wants to be a journalist. I've tried talking him out of it, but he doesn't want to. He wants to become a music journo, so he has his own blog now. He's 16. He's been writing about music now for 4 years. So that's what he wants to be known for. So I believe that he needs trust from his readers to actually tell his story. So trust, I believe, is very important. So I think there's a difference between having a cynical view and questioning to trust. So when it comes to trust in businesses, for example, if you trust a business, you're more likely to pay more for that product. You're more likely to tell your friends to buy that product. You're more likely to get better market entry to a new country. You're more likely to have better relationships with the government. So trust is very important. If you don't have trust, and I think you should need to watch a certain food company, Monsanto, out of the States at the moment, and really watch what is going to happen with that. Because if you start saying that it's good to have low trust, it's good to watch people, but as soon as that trust dips below a certain point, you cannot function or operate. When it comes to the media, and David's point's spot on, in the next 5 years, if the media's trust in media drops, people just won't consume it, and so that it won't exist. So it is important, but it's a balancing act. And I can show you later, we have 16 criteria that make up trust. So a lot of things. At the bottom is operational, so your finances. In Hong Kong, companies, the first thing they want to tell you about is how much money they're making, and they think that builds trust. That sits at the bottom. It's important, but it's only the ticket to the game. You have to have good financials before you can even play. The highest thing is how you treat your employees, and which is very interesting in this part of the world.
No, I think that's right. I mean, you talked about ticket to the game for companies. I think trust is a ticket to the game for media. If, just at the very basic level, if the fact that Andrew doesn't even talk to Apple daily tells you something. If there is a journalist who consistently gets dates and the spelling of names wrong, would you actually trust her on a more substantive conclusion? You have to have trust before you actually can get the readership and do anything more deep. Jason?
Okay. Two questions. One, in countries where there's a prevalence of conspiracy theories, I'm thinking Pakistan or even where I'm based in South Korea, is this, or I don't know if your research has delved into this, but are conspiracy theories the result of an already existing lack of trust, or do they cause the lack of trust? And also, I'm just curious on your opinions about China's, recent developments of English language 24-hour news channels, Xinhua, CCTV, and opening up bureaus in the U.S. or trying to make an international presence in media. Can they build international? Can government-led media? How can they build trust internationally? Can that actually work?
The psychology of conspiracy theory is something I don't have a lot of knowledge about, but I think it's more cultural. I think there'll be heritage there if you have a look at the way they have always operated. To your point around democracy, I don't, as I said before, I don't really look at country versus country because I think that's an unfair comparison. I prefer to look at year-on-year data for that particular country. So when we first started looking at China, they were extremely high. Their level of trust was extremely high. It started to drop a bit. Now, we don't think that trust is decreasing in China. We just think it's normalising. And I have a cynical view of the research for China a little bit, and I've voiced this to our research firm who do it, because if an American research firm rang me and I was in China and they said, I want to ask you about the government, I'm not going to trash the government. Yeah, it's good, it's fine. I like them. And also informed publics, you must remember that informed publics in China are usually connected to the government as well. So you must address it. So I look at China as year by year. But I think, what was the second part of the question?
It's about Xinhua. That's it. Yeah. I mean, China desperately wants soft power. But soft power isn't something you can just buy, right? You can't push it. There has to be pull as well. And I think there will only start to be pull if the English language arms start to do things which are different from pure propaganda ministry-led stories. So even if CCTV started to do its own real interviews with leaders, I think that would be a huge step in the right direction, but they don't. So I think what they've done is they've built a shell, but they haven't yet filled that shell with things that will actually help them achieve their aims. Whether they'll ever be able to do that, I don't know. But at least they've built something big, but it's tough. I mean, if you look around the world, France 24 has not been terribly successful at building soft power for France. Maybe Sean, you can talk about the Korea's own efforts, where you're a part of it. But it's very hard because you can put stuff out there, but you've got to have the pull of people wanting to accept, to view with a cynical, questioning eye, and then to be influenced by. And that's a very long, complex process. That who's done it well? You look at BBC, but they've been doing it for, I don't know, for 150 years, that to build the world services reputation, trust, where people look at it as not only a great vehicle for producing news, but also as an emblem of all that is best about Britain. It's a tough road, and it's a long road.
And just on trust, BBC is a great example. So their trust is so high that when they have scandals, that people tend to not forgive them, but can overcome those criticism concerns quicker than they would if you don't trust an organisation. So it's a pretty basic, it's almost like a binary situation. The other thing, I think you all should take a very keen interest, and Dave and I spoke about this before we started today, keen interest in Chinese companies trying to go global. There is no real Chinese company brand that's global yet, not a real one. There's Japan brands, there's Korean brands, but China hasn't really nailed a brand yet. And they finally have probably got one in Huawei, and yet they can barely make it in the States because the Senate is smashing them all the time on whether they're spying. It's the red peril, it's communism coming to get them the other way. And that's really interesting. So Huawei and ZTE, the two big telecoms of China, are really struggling to get a foothold in the States now based on trust. They're just not trusted. And so how do you build that trust if you work within that organisation or for them so they can have the opportunity to do business? It's actually bullying tactics. But I'll get off the high horse now.
All right, so go
But that's
here
trust
and then
in
over there.
essence.
Hi, Tiffany at SCMP. I have two questions. The first one's for Andrew. Do you have any information about trust in non-traditional media? So I'm talking about bloggers, because in the past year, especially with cultural journalism, so I'm talking about food, fashion, travel, I think people have started to realize just how much of an operation that is, that actually, you know, they're writing about this Prada bag because they were gifted it, or they're writing about the banyan tree in the Maldives because it was a free trip. So what does that mean for both sides, consumer and media companies, if they don't trust traditional media institutions, and they don't really trust bloggers either? Second question is that you've both emphasized building your personal brand so much. So what are some practical things that people can do, you know, besides going beyond tweeting?
So I do have some data, and I'll share that with you, Tiffany, from the non-traditional. We are seeing a rise in blogger trust and those sort of things. But we treat bloggers like journalists now, so we have blogger events. It is a different game, but they're a different target audience. So we're not chasing general new media consumption with bloggers, we're chasing their fan base. And they are trusted to their fans. When it comes to building a profile, just do the basic things for starters. Get a good Twitter handle, send a Weibo, WeChat, whatever you want to do. And don't be we spend a lot of time talking about the conflict between PR and media. And all I ask is that you embrace the fact we work in the same space now. And embrace those PR professionals, and I use the word professionals very tightly, not loosely. The PR professionals, the ones who take pride in what they do, and start having relationships, because they're the ones who will give you stories. They're the ones who will work with you. Treat them cynically as well, because you know what they're trying to do. But that's how you will build your profile, both within that industry, which will allow you access to greater stories and greater access to people within the organisations. So when we think about, say, if I was going to put someone up to speak to you, I would say, who are we confident in giving her? Are we ready to give the CEO to her? So we actually make decisions on trust. So we would look at David and say, experienced, trusted journalist, we're happy to have the CEO sit down. If not, we'll sit the head of marketing down. So we make decisions based on how we think you will go. And it's not about manipulating you, and it's not about trying to spin the way in it. It's about saying we trust you in your profession, and we'll put someone against that. So those stories and those opportunities are really great for you as well. And even simple things like LinkedIn profiles. We search LinkedIn straight away when we're chasing journalists now. They're a client, so we always go straight to LinkedIn and find out if the journalist is there, because we can find out where they've been, what they've written, where they've come from. So just get all your online presence ready.
I think what I would do, I'd just add to that is that you have to, brand is exactly what it is. It's your brand, just the way a company has a brand. So that means you actually have to curate your online presence carefully. If you have on LinkedIn a very professional photo, but then your Twitter handle is you falling down drunk in a bar, there's a mismatch there. The falling down drunk in the bar might be you, and it might be very honest, but it's not the brand that you want to actually be showing. So you actually have to give thought to what you tweet about, what privacy settings you have on Facebook, what you put on LinkedIn, how you present yourself, because everything you do actually contributes to your brand.
Actually, what you're talking about goes along with what I'm about to ask. I'm Bobby Calvon. I'm visiting from the U.S., Washington, D.C. I was most recently a political reporter with the Boston Globe. I'm wondering, we're here on a college campus. I'm wondering what differences you see among up-and-coming journalists versus veterans, whether or not our education system is serving them well, and whether or not they have the same ethic that I like to think that many of us veterans have developed over the years. And just an observation, I think it's lacking. I think that in this Twitter-happy world where we can spit out anything we want to without any repercussions, at least we think without any repercussions, all of that has been lost. At the Boston Globe, we are not required to tweet or Facebook or anything like that. It seems as if young people are compelled to do all that. I certainly do it because I need to develop my brand, and I'm very mindful of my brand and being trustworthy. But I'm wondering if kids are being, excuse me for calling you kids, but I'm wondering if young people these days are being taught, again, this ethic of being trustworthy.
So kids and millennials.
Look, I think my view on this is that journalism education just needs to be rethought, and I felt that for an awfully long time, and that comes from just one simple basic fact. During the 10 years or so that I was at the most senior management level of Reuters, I probably hired 600 people, 700 people. If you asked me now to identify which of those people had gone to journalism school and which of those hadn't, no way could I do that. I could flip a coin and maybe I beat the coin, maybe not. There's so little difference between someone who's gone through a formal journalistic education and someone who has actually just developed her craft through our craft. Neither did I. So so maybe I'm prejudiced because of that. But I think journalism schools have to actually rethink their role, and I would posit it has to be about developing people who are truly entrepreneurial, truly thinking about the future, and truly inventing the new journalism that we're going towards.
So two things. I think that the kids or the younger generation, I think sending tweets out is a thought process for us and something we do. For them it's natural. So I don't even look at it as something that they have to do. They just do it. And they should do it. The second thing is we're missing people like you. You walk into a newsroom now, there are no veterans in there. There's no crusty guy in the corner yelling at you when your story is crap, when you make a mistake, when your sources are bad, that's the stuff that's missing now. I know, but not enough places, mate, not enough places. That's the sad thing. I learned all my journalism from two guys in a newsroom. I went to university for 3 years. I was the drunk photos on Twitter at university. I went to university so I could get a job. That's the only reason I went to journalism school, because otherwise you couldn't get a job in Australia. And then there was two guys in that newsroom, I'm still my mentors now, who taught me everything about journalism. They beat it into me in the first 6 months. And I think that's what's lacking. Veterans who can talk about what real journalism is, and what really having great writing skills, being able to have sources, think about wider, broader stories. I think that what's lacking now is we're simplifying complex stories, and we have to do that as journalists, but sometimes we're just missing the real point of a story.
But there's also these institutional lapses. I mean, many newsrooms in the U.S., for example, don't even have ethics policies for online, tweeting and so forth. I mean, I was at the Sacramento Bee where I developed our ethical policies for Facebook and tweets, and we put them in line with, again, the old school ethics, and again, it is just another form of publication, a different platform, but it is publication differently in the eyes of the law, but still it's publication.
Yeah, it's published material.
Hi, my name is Rachel Liu. I'm a co-founder of Tea Leaf Nation. We are one of the new sort of news sites about China. And we're currently looking for a monetization model, so to speak, and we're looking for businesses as clients. So my question for the two of you is how, as to build a brand, and how do you specifically make your clients trust you, in your business dealings with them?
Well, I just say that, first of all, I think that what you've built in Tea Leaf Nation is terrific, and you know that I'm a huge fan of it, and I think it does really, really important work. I think you just now have to think of how you take that the next step further, where you can get people who do appreciate the kind of work that you do, or that kind of model, and get them to pay for something more. Not easy. And I face the same issue. Is that I guess my reputation, to use your differentiation, my reputation is based on what I've done over the past 25 plus years of my career. But no one's actually paying me for that. That gets me in the door. The trust that I'm worth, the astronomically high fees that I charge, that comes from doing something practical and doing something valuable and doing something that actually fits a need. And there's no magic to that. It's just a hard slog of trying to fit the pieces into the puzzle.
It's a great example. I mean, he gets paid for trust. So his reputation gets him in the door, but trust is his fee. So you pay him because you trust that he can do the job. If he doesn't do the job, then he won't get called back to do the job again. So part of the way you build trust is by delivering on expectation and meeting the promises that you make, working in ethically and truthful way. I mean, there's so many factors that make up trust, but the most important thing is you meet their expectation for what they put their trust in you. And we work in professional services, so we are paid fees and rates. So if we don't deliver to what that expected value is, then we won't get the callbacks. Very, very simple. And congratulations, well done as well.
So it seems as if you are starting a new media venture, if you want to be a blogger or you have your own website, in order to eventually monetize, you basically deliver the product first, consistently, over a period of time, and then hopefully then monetization will follow?
Well, I mean, just to use the Tea Leaf Nation example, they've built a reputation. So people who are in the China field know that they do tremendous work looking at China's social media and distilling some of the lessons that you can get from that. That's a reputation. But they've delivered that for free. So I now expect that for free. Yeah. So
how do you cross over?
So I think that the next step is for them to say something like, I don't know, we will give you a bespoke version of it for your company, and we'll and pay us $1 million a year for that. And someone will say, oh, great, you can do that? Fine, of course. And maybe they'll get 5 people to say that. But you know, they've developed a reputation, they've built a brand, but now they have to think of what's the next step that actually can get us some money for that. And it can't be the same thing that they're doing, because they've built that expectation that that's for free.
So you've been advocating building your personal brand, but I've mentioned this to some other experts before, and they seem to dismiss that in the sense that, oh well, if it's just a brand based on a person or a few number of people, it can quickly die as fast as it came up. What do you think is the strategy for a long term?
Okay, so I think, look, just to take an example, right? So there's this guy in the U.S. called Felix Salmon, prolific blogger on financial issues, and he started out with, I think, Portfolio magazine, which went bust. So his platform died. He kept on going. So then when I started a commentary service at Reuters, he was one of the first people that I hired. Why? Because he had an audience, because he had a reputation, because he was prolific, because I knew he would deliver. And he has, and he continues to do so.
There is no success in not doing it. So if you don't do it, you will never be, there's only downside to that. So I can't understand why he just wouldn't do it. Yes, sometimes the brand might get ahead of you, but you've got to be in it. So you've got to start to build it. And I do believe with David that the journalists of the future, I think maybe in even 15 years' time, it'll be more about the producer you go to. So I actually will go to someone like you and say, I want you to curate my news for me.
So there are going to be people out there who are going to be great producers, journalists, and curators who will create their own media portals to a certain degree that that I would work with, either from a company perspective or a personal perspective, to start curating my news for me. Because the challenge I see as well is that the information, as we all know, is exploding, and there's that many more news sites starting that it's getting harder and harder to access the information that you want, which means that we are starting to go back to traditional media and just relying on them because it's going too wide. But I'll be very interested to see those who can start to curate all those news sites and all that media and start to bring it in for personal and business use. No one's done it properly yet.
All right, well, I guess we all have a directive in experimenting with a new media model. Thank you guys so much.
You got it all bite off it.
Well, let's give Andrew and David a round of applause for joining us. Thank you.